Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Betty staggered toward the country store. Her mood was good because she'd managed to intercept her father before he did. He was off work all the time, but sometimes he'd take orders when his head wasn't hurting at least a little. And then the yard smelled deliciously of wood. Mother waited patiently for the work to be done. David, Betty's father, was a good woodworker. It was said about him in the village that if David took to making frames, he never had to fix the windows with anything, because he adjusted everything so that no wind could get through. It was his profession that turned my father into a quiet alkie. They paid a lot of money, and everyone also felt it was their duty just to get the job done. A year later, after my father became drunk almost every day, together with him began to drink and my mother. First just for company, and then out of sorrow for the past rich life. For some reason I felt sorry for my mother, but not as sorry as I felt for my father. Mom was always just swearing, never a kind word from her. She'd nag my father and scold her, but she was nothing herself. She never even worked, even though in the village that's unacceptable. And Betty walked into the store. Hello, the clerk, a beautiful, large woman, smiled. Hi, how are you? Sorry, I didn't get a chance to answer. There were other women in the store, and one of them said, "How can you not ask how things are in that house? Everybody knows how things are." Betty, you remind your mother about the debt. Betty got confused, blushed. Anna put her hands to her sides. What are you doing? Nancy's totally freaking out. Betty, what does this debt have to do with anything? It's a hard life. My family's in trouble, and I'm just a kid. Nancy had already realized she'd said the wrong thing. It's really nothing to do with the kid. Bad luck with the parents. She fights them, but she also studies well. Nancy said, "Don't be so hard on yourself." That was a slip of the tongue. You know it wasn't out of spite. And you, Betty, don't listen to me. I'm not having a good day today. Betty tried to smile, but she didn't do a very good job. And Nancy hurried out of the store to avoid Anna's eyes. Everyone knew the temper of the only store clerk. Even the men were afraid of her. In the store always behaved quietly, politely, and very decent. What's interesting is that the clerk's husband was of small stature, quiet, not talkative. Two sons grew up very much like their father. From the outside, it would seem that the Annas had the husband down. That's why he's so quiet. But in fact, that family in the village still talked about how Stephen achieved Anna. And there was love and respect. And Betty, what do you want? I'll have some pasta, whatever's cheapest, sugar, oil. And can I have a small piece of cookie dough? Betty watched as with a generous hand, Anna cut off the cookies and hurried to say, "Oh, Aunt Anna, I have so much money, and it won't be a big deal. You can bring it back later." Well, you know it's later. Just then, another woman came up to them, one of those who were standing in the store. "Betty, take it. I'll pay for it. You've helped me so many times." The woman turned to Anna. "Anna, and weigh the candy. I'm sorry, I want to cry, both from shame and something more." She put the money she had on the counter, thanked her, and walked out. Anna looked after her thoughtfully. Good girl. What will happen to her next? As long as she didn't follow in her mother's and father's footsteps. The woman who had volunteered to pay for Betty said she wouldn't have to. That's the example I'm looking at. That's the thing, an example. You're right there. How's Clara? Betty's neighbor waved. And don't ask. David, what's gonna work on a rare day? That's the way it's gonna go down. And that bastard doesn't even try to make a difference. I don't think he'd be singing like that if it wasn't for her. He's kind, and this one won't say a decent word. David's unlucky to have a wife. I'm surprised she gave birth to such a pathetic little girl. Anna, you've fallen from the moon, haven't you? I don't know what you mean. There's another customer. Everyone in the village says they have Betty. They even wave their arms. Fuck you women for making up stuff. Anna, you really don't know what they say in the village. but now you've calmed down. And before there was talk. Yes, speak up. What are you talking about? Clara. I lowered my voice. David and her. And they lived for 6 years, if not more kids. They didn't have kids. They said they had a lot of scandals. And then they left, supposedly to change the climate. 6 months later, they came back in winter and said they didn't even know Anna was pregnant. Do you believe that? She had 3 months, if not more. She didn't know. Everyone here thinks there's no way Betty could be their daughter. They just don't say anything. How could they? She's really so stupid. I mean, David brought her from somewhere else. She's not from around here. Anna stood there with her eyes wide open. That's news to me. Why, I don't know anything. What the hell is this? Clara laughed. So you were on maternity leave then? William is 2 months older than your oldest. And then, when you weren't working, things settled down. Anna got ahead of the woman. That way she can find out everything and take Betty away from them. Clara sighed. It's not that simple. Let's say Betty isn't theirs. They're legal parents, which means they're legal, which suggests that her parents, if there were any, didn't need her. But either they don't exist at all. Well, you don't know for better or worse. Okay, I'm gonna go. There was some discussion in the store about the events of the past few years, but then everyone left. Of course, Betty didn't know anything about all the excitement about her figure. She went home and started cooking dinner. Not her father, not her mother, not at home. They must have gone to the edge of the village again. A friend and drinking buddy of theirs lived there. They used to go there often. Sometimes they didn't come home for 2 or 3 days. Before, when I was about 10 years old, it was scary to be alone. But then I got used to it. I even liked it. No one wandering around half the night trying to sing songs or falling down. I must pay tribute, no matter how they sang. But they never gathered companies at home. I never brought anyone. And he strictly forbade his mother. It was getting dark outside. Even though it was spring, it was already dark at 10 o'clock. And there was still frost at night. And Betty drank sweet tea, which is rare in their house. And she was getting ready to go to bed for school tomorrow. 2 more months until graduation, and then 2 more years, and all she would be able to enter, study, and leave. Of course, she would not leave her parents, would come sometimes, but not often. There was no desire, and these 2 years to look at their parties. Sorry, I stretched out on my bed. I tried to remember when they started drinking. Dad, when she started school. And Betty remembers well that he couldn't take her to the 1st grade, and her mother had already gone to the 3rd grade, when she noticed that her mother was cheerful every night, kind. Then in her childish naivety, Betty thought, well, let her not yell at anyone. Now I realized I would have been better off screaming. Betty was already dozing off. There had once been a TV in the house, but it hadn't worked for a long time, so she always fell asleep with a book. She was beginning to dream, but she was awakened by screams outside the window. Betty looked out the window. There were people running somewhere, and the sky was on one side of the village, and Betty quickly got dressed and ran outside. She ran to where the people were rushing, but after a few steps her legs became heavy. A house was burning, and from everything it looked like it was burning in the exact spot where her parents' crony lived. She almost stopped, and then she ran. She had never run like that in her life. She could hear the people she ran past yelling to her, Betty, "Stop, stop, stop. You can't go in there." Just outside the house, someone caught her hard. "Hush, hush, girl." She looked at Uncle Stephen and his wife Anna, who was really there, wanted to break free, but already Anna had her pinned down. And Betty realized everything, screamed and sobbed. Then it was all a blur. Allah's mother Betty arrived. She hardly knew her. Her grandmother had no contact with her parents or her. She dealt with the funeral on the day of the funeral after everything. The girl lay in her room and cried quietly. She could hear perfectly well what the women were talking about as they cleared the table Clara had started. She asked when the grandmother was leaving. The woman who was grandmother. Of course, one could hardly call it that. And I'm going tomorrow morning. The woman who was there looked at her in surprise. Alone. Of course, who should I go with? What about Betty? But that's not my problem. There are special bodies for that. Clara even raised her voice. What are you talking about? You guys have 2 years of school left. Are you going to put her in an orphanage? Where should I take her home? But that would be the right thing to do. No, you think it's the right thing to do. I know it doesn't. I don't want a stranger in my house. Yeah, how can you call your granddaughter a stranger? And she banged her fist on the table so I can. I guess I know a little more than you do. I don't think I'll wait till morning. I'll find a ride. I don't need this house. If you need to sign any papers in Betty's favor, here's my address. And she's gone. Betty heard the door slam and went straight into the room and heard everything. I understand. They sat down on the table. Clara put her arm around her. Betty, maybe she'll come to her senses, and I don't want to go to her. I'd rather go to the orphanage. The women looked at each other. Anna lost her eyes angrily. And Betty was seen off by the whole village. They brought all sorts of sweets. Clara baked a big cake. Betty, when you come to visit, the boys will make sure you're well received. All right, Aunt Clara, I'll treat you. All the way Betty looked out the window. I wonder if she'll see all this. Aunt Anna and Aunt Clara said they'd keep an eye on the house. It wasn't clear whether she would need it or not. They drove up to the big building with the high gates in the dark and took her into a white room. There sat a woman in a white coat and some other lady. While the doctor or nurse was writing down something from Betty's papers, the other one came up to her. Why so much stuff? Don't you know that the state takes care of you? And there's no need to bring so much unsanitary stuff here. These are gifts for the children. Here are sweets and a wine pie. I looked at the angry aunt in confusion. Goodies, you say? Maybe you put something in it. What are you talking about? Shut up. I'm taking all the goodies. She took the museum ones, examined all the things, shook them, left the girl only 2 books and a bag with clothes. You can take this. It's for the kids. You'll make arrangements with me now. And on the first day you'll go. The woman in the white coat hurried Betty away. You're out of luck today, and Vanessa's on duty. She's a certified teacher. She just doesn't have a soul. Don't feel bad. She's on duty once every 3 days. Who are you? Betty kept wiping away the tears she was watching. And I, Miranda, am your doctor. Here we are. The woman stopped in front of the door. This is where the older girls live. There are those who have been here since birth. And then there are those who, like you, are new here. Anyway, you'll get to know each other gradually. And she pushed open the door. Betty entered a large room, and there were either 10 or 12 beds. The room didn't look empty or scary. Rather the opposite. Nearly every bed had brightly colored rugs and homemade ones by the bed, but they were selling real coziness. Miranda said loudly, "Girls, pay attention. Meet Betty. This is Betty. She will now be living with you." A sigh came from somewhere in the back of the room, and another one was thrown away. Miranda immediately turned at the voice. "Are you wrong?" "Oh, Betty. My parents died a few days ago." "Right away what?" Betty smiled faintly. At school, a lot of people answered the same way. Miranda walked away, showing her the bed. The girl walked over, sat down. The tears rolled with renewed vigor. A girl of about 13 immediately appeared next to her and handed her a glass of water. "You're not trying to hold back." A series for the first week. There's no other way. Girls started coming up to them. Some sat next to them. Some leaned against the headboard. "Let's get acquainted." The girl who served in water seemed to be the head girl, although there were some who were older than her. "My name is Molly. My parents turned me in here. I was interfering with their lives." And Betty looked up at her in surprise. "You say that so calmly that I should cry." "No, I'm used to it. I've been here for 7 years, and it's okay to live. Let them cry. Someday I'll grow up, and then they'll remember me." Molly's eyes sparkled. One of the older girls said, "Molly, stop scaring Betty. You don't think we have a nice room, a friendly room. It's just that it's customary for you to come and tell us about yourself. I mean, we're living together now." And Betty nodded. She kept it short. At the end, she told about the conversation she'd overheard. Molly looked at her with huge eyes. Wow, I mean, it could very well not be their daughter at all. Betty shrugged her shoulders. "I don't think so. You can't hide something like that in the village. I think grandmother's foggy just to keep me away. And I wouldn't go myself. But it's the right thing to do. I, for example, ran away from my grandmother myself. I was only needed, and only to get my hands on the money. So I was put in an orphanage, and all my accounts were frozen. When I get out, I'll manage it myself. My grandmother is going crazy. At first she asked me to come back, said I was her favorite granddaughter. Then she yelled at me. And then she told me a joke, said she was gonna put me in a hospital and take custody of me." Listening to the Betty girl's stories, I was in complete shock. She thought it was a tragedy for her, but it turns out that tragedy is commonplace here. Suddenly, a bell rang in the corner. Molly jumped up. "Get down quickly and open up." All the girls were in their beds in a minute, just as they were in their clothes, rumbling under the covers. Not 2 minutes later, the door opened. Into the room opened Betty. Through closed eyelids, immediately recognized Evgenia Sergeevna. She walked around the room, satisfied, hummed, and came out. Nobody moved, and Betty wanted to say something. But then the door opened sharply, and Evgenia Sergeevna looked in again. But everything was quiet, and at last she left. Soon the girls crowded around Betty's bed again, only now without light. Betty asked, "What was that just now?" "That's our warning system for when Cerberus goes on his rounds. So we get a call from room 1, we get the next one, and so on." "Wow. Why Cerberus? Who's Cerberus?" "She's mean, she's scary. And I see nobody likes her around here. Can you believe all the goodies she brought here? The neighbors gave them to her. Even the cake Aunt Clara baked, she took it all away. What a bastard. And you're lucky to be on her shift. The rest of us are all right." Molly let out a long sigh. In general, she was the most emotional and mobile. "Okay, let's go to sleep. Otherwise, this one might come and check up on us." Strangely enough, Betty fell asleep quickly. Maybe it was the events of the last few days. Maybe she was just tired. In the morning, they were awakened for breakfast, and she looked around. Everything is new. Everything is so unusual. They didn't have anything like this in the village. After a couple of weeks, Betty had settled in completely. She made friends not only with the girls in her room, but also with the others. She tried to study as well as she had in the village. Molly wondered about Betty. "What do you need this study for? Doesn't anyone need it now? Or do you think an orphanage kid can get into something?" "Nonsense. They don't take us anywhere. They don't want us anywhere." And Betty laughed back. "How are you going to come and announce that you're an orphan?" "Why? I'm not gonna tell anyone. And don't tell me you're gonna come in all smart. You'll pass the exams and get in. And then they can do whatever they want. They say you came to study." Molly thought seriously about Betty's words, but then she said, "No, it's not for me. I have another purpose in life." "What's that?" Molly sat down next to her. "You know, I'm really looking forward to growing up, being released from here, going into, well, let's say, a bank and finding my parents. They were going to work abroad at the time, like overseas. That's why they gave up on me. You see, they gave up their child to go to a place where a good life was waiting for them." "Molly, are you crazy? Bunk. How can you imagine that? It's a felony. Will you get caught before you get out of there?" "No, I'll run away." "That's not a good plan. Do you love your parents so much that you'd do anything to find them?" Molly looked at her in surprise, then laughed. "I do. You're out of your mind. I'm going to look for them to get even." Betty was now looking at Molly in surprise. "How long ago did you decide that?" "As soon as I started thinking." And Betty knew she had to say something. She had to talk Molly out of it. She realized that you can't talk a person out of something they've been carrying around for years. You have to take it one step at a time. And Betty just got sick of the idea of helping Molly not to ruin her life. The girl did not have much time, and she decided to ask Miranda for help. She chose a day when the orphanage was quiet and knocked on her office. "Miranda, it's okay, of course." "Betty, come in, you're sick." "Is something wrong?" "No, I wanted to talk, to consult." The woman put down her pen and looked at Betty carefully. There didn't seem to be any object stains on the girl. How many times had girls come to her with the same problem? They were pregnant. And they all had no idea how it happened. "Sit down, Betty. What did you want to talk about?" Betty sat down, laughed a little. Then she looked at the doctor. "You know about Molly hatching an idea, an obsession, that she must by any means necessary find her parents and get even with them." The woman took a discreet breath. Well, thank goodness it wasn't what she thought it was. Well, how can I put it? I'd heard about it, but I didn't think it was serious. "Very serious, Miranda. Look at this, she's even drawing it." And Betty held out some drawings that were, frankly, shiver-inducing. "Yeah, it's a lot worse than I thought. There should be a counselor working on this." "Wait, Miranda. Working with a counselor will be noted in her file. Right? Well, yeah, we're always flagging things like that. But it's just gonna mess up your life." "Well, not that you're right in any way. Do you have another idea?" "I do. That's why I came to you." They talked for almost an hour, and Betty left Miranda satisfied and laden with special literature. And the doctor thought, the girl is not so simple. Thinking is very right, even without knowing the basics of psychology. Let her try it. Maybe she'll succeed. When it was time to leave the orphanage in winter, everyone saw her off. Miranda said, "Betty, I'm begging you, don't back down. You have to get in. You'll make a great, just the best psychologist. I promise you, Miranda, and I won't back down." Betty hugged Molly. "Just don't get lost. I've left you some addresses. I'll text you when I get into school. And you remember to come straight to my village if you need anything. It doesn't matter if I'll be there or not. I'll go there for a month and warn Aunt Clara." "I got it." Molly cried. She understood. "Molly, be good. You and I will find everything. And I'll be honest, I promise." Betty got in without any problems. Afterward, when the admission lists were posted, Betty's dean approached her. "Why didn't they tell you you were from an orphanage?" Betty immediately tensed up. What did it matter? The dean was embarrassed. "No, you wouldn't think anything of it. On the contrary, you would have been relieved." "Why?" "I did well on my exams. Or maybe it's just that people from orphanages aren't as smart." She embarrassed the dean completely. He was wise. He'd seen a lot. And frankly, he was used to kids from orphanages always trying to exploit the fact that they were orphans, to push them around. And here he got a real comeuppance. He looked at Betty leaving and thought that she could do anything she wanted to. Betty, unlike those who spent time at the institute, studied about once every 2 to 3 months. She traveled to the countryside. The first time she came right after she left the orphanage. She stepped off the bus and froze. Everything was so native, so everything was beautiful. She hadn't been here for almost 2.5 years. Everything seems to be the same. But at the same time, everything had changed. She walked slowly, as if absorbing everything she had been deprived of. Lately, the path from the bus stop to home lay through the village stores. Of course, Betty could not pass by. She walked in and stood aside. There weren't many people. Betty stood and looked at the shop windows. Aunt Anna risked a glance at her and began to serve another customer when there was no one left in the store. The woman asked, "Can I show you something?" And Betty turned to her, and her lips stretched themselves. "Hello, Auntie." The woman stared at her for a moment, then opened her eyes wide. Betty. It couldn't be. She jumped out from behind the counter and rushed to hug the girl. "My God, she's grown up to be a real beauty. You'd think we'd found a beauty too." The door of the store opened, and Aunt Clara came in. "Hello, who's that hugging?" Clara looked at Betty curiously. Suddenly, she stopped smiling. "Betty, are you?" "I'm Aunt Clara." Now I had to hug Clara for another 5 minutes. That evening, Betty had a real party at home. And when she left, there were so many things Betty thought she'd never get them. Studying. She liked it so much that she was ready. She was willing to spend day and night at the institute. By the way, Betty had made friends with the very dean she had talked to when she enrolled. Now the girl was embarrassed in front of him. Well, how could she be? She'd almost sassed him. Sometime in her 3rd year, Betty returned from a visit. She'd been to a classmate's birthday party. The evening was warm, and the sky was beautiful. And even though it was quite late, Betty decided to take a walk, and Betty just enjoyed it. It was very rare to be able to go for a walk like this. All the time was taken up by studies and work. Already in her 1st year, Betty found a part-time job, and now she worked 3 times a week in a nursing home. To be honest, it was hard. Not so much physically, but mentally. There are so many people who have lived their lives in so many different ways, and they end up the same way, along with those who have wasted their lives. There were those who worked to the last. Next to the lonely lived those who had both children and grandchildren, but they simply became unnecessary. The fate of one grandmother caused a storm of emotions in Zenit. Adriana worked at a factory all her life. She married, but lost her husband when she was 40. She raised her children by herself, married them herself, helped them, earned a good big apartment as she could. That's why she ended up in a nursing home. The worst part is that Adriana took it all for granted. She'd say, "I'm sorry. It's okay. I've lived my life. What does it matter how I live out my last few years? The important thing is that the kids do well." Betty resented it. "It's wrong. It's not right. It's not right. You put your whole life into your kids, and they just throw you away." But Adriana just smiled, stroked Betty's hand, and said it was nothing. "I've had mine." And Betty thought about it so much that she passed the turnoff to her street. She turned around and wanted to go back, when she heard some mumbling from the bushes. Her first impulse was to run, but the realization that someone might need her help stopped her. She approached the bushes. "Who's there? Do you need help? You're for wrestling." And a young man appeared in front of her. Appears to be 25, 27, and tall, statuesque, dressed very modestly, and his clothes hadn't been washed in a while. Most importantly, the guy was drunk. He looked at her with cloudy eyes, and Betty wasn't frightened, probably because his eyes, despite his condition, were still very kind. "Hello, you're not ashamed of scaring people?" "Sorry, I didn't mean to," the guy answered and hiccuped. And Betty smiled involuntarily. "Why are you hiding in the bushes?" "I'm not hiding. I'm thinking about what? Why is life so unfair to me?" A young man with a head, and Betty realized that in front of her was an ordinary, desperate man who decided to solve all problems by drinking. And you decided to spruce her up. He waved his hand. "You don't understand. My girlfriend dumped me, and then I lost my job." "Yeah, well, that's a great excuse to stop being human," the girl said. "So you're not meant for each other. And the job? I've never heard of a young, healthy guy in the city who can't get a job." The young man looked at her condescendingly. "How easy is it for you to reason when you have support from all sides? And mommy, and daddy, and a bunch of everyone else who's worried about you. When you're all alone in the world." The young man looked like he was about to shed a tear, but Betty didn't give him the chance. "Well, of course you think so, don't you? Well, I, for one, have no one. And I came into the world from an orphanage." He looked at her incredulously. "Who you are, and who I am. What's the big deal? Can't single people have a normal life? Can't they start a family on their own so they won't be lonely?" They talked until the morning. The guy's name was James, and as they said in the lectures, he just snapped. From that day on, James was someone Betty had to help. The guy didn't drink anymore. As it turned out, he wasn't an alcoholic. He just had a lot on his plate. So he got drunk. 2 weeks later, he got lucky and got a job. And Betty was happy as a baby. James had a lot more confidence. He was getting a good salary, dressed, scared, and even made repairs in his little apartment. Betty insisted that James enroll in one course and then another. He resisted as much as he could. "Betty, why would I do that? I mean, James, you have to be prepared for any situation. What if you lose your job? You know so much, you know so much." James looked at her with loving eyes, and Betty was embarrassed, although James had never noticed this before in the company. Everyone in the group had been married for a long time. James met her from class when he could, always with flowers. She used to swear at him. "Why do you spend money on flowers? Betty, you don't understand. I don't want anything for you. Nothing, you know. You're the best person in the world." Betty didn't even realize that their relationship was in a different phase. She had exams ahead of her diploma defense, and then they were going to get married. After the diploma was received and the application to the registry office was filed, they were sitting in a cafe celebrating the occasion. Betty said, "I couldn't believe it. Once I only dreamed of being a psychologist, and now I'm a specialist. I can help people." James smiled as he looked at her. "You've already helped the most important person in your life." "Sorry," I laughed. "You have a lot of humility." Noticing that James seemed offended, she hurried to say, "Why are you offended?" "Well, of course you're the most important person. Betty, have you ever thought about making your family the center of your life? I've always wanted a big family. You know how you dream about it. But I'm a man. I gotta work and earn. But you, I would like so much that we had at least 2 children, that you would be at home with them, that you know to all sorts of sections, that I would rush to your house, and you would be waiting for me." "Sorry," almost cried. "Of course. How could a woman want anything else?" After a modest wedding, they decided to go to the country for a couple of weeks in the winter. "Do you have no idea how nice it is here? You've never seen such beauty in your life. And what kind of people do we have?" James' skeptical thought, "Well, let's say I won't argue with you about the beauty. I've been to the countryside. I've seen the untouched nature. But I have my doubts about the people. It always seemed to me that in the village live gossipers and drunkards." "James, what are you talking about? It's not true. You'll see for yourself soon enough." They'd been driving for half an hour and she felt her chest tighten. She hadn't been to the village for almost a year. She missed everyone and everything. The grass, the sunshine, the jar. And Betty jumped out of the car at the gate. "Oh my God, you're so good," and she laughed. James looked at her and realized that he had gotten a real smart and beautiful Betty. Aunt Clara came rushing toward them. The girl saw her and rushed to her neck. "Aunt Clara, how have I missed you?" The woman hugged her, then turned her around, considered her. Beautiful, how fashionable she had become. "I don't recognize her." "And who's that with you?" She looked curiously at James. He came over, smiled. "Allow me to introduce myself. Husband of this beautiful and fashionable lady." Clara shook her hands. "What kind of husband is a real husband?" Betty laughed. "Yes, Aunt Clara. The very real one." "How could it be? How can it be?" "Oh, we should celebrate. We should call. Aunt Clara, we've only been married 2 days." "We've been married." "That's good. Now, I'll have it all organized by tonight." James put his arm around Aunt Clara. "You just come over tonight. We'll organize everything ourselves." "Yes, Betty." She looked at her husband with loving eyes. What a good, understanding man he was, wasn't he? Sure. Clara ran off as fast as her age would allow. Betty and James entered the house. Everything was dusty and gray. James smiled. "Shall we get to it? You go open the windows, we'll get things in order." "Oh, James, I have to go to the store. And cooking. You have no idea. But evening in the village starts at 6 o'clock. James scratched his forehead. "Oh, wait, don't wait. Do we have to start somewhere?" I'll flood the house. Then you and I to the store. Then you for order. And I'm in charge. Do I hate salad? Betty hugged him, looked into his eyes. Are you the best? About 2 hours later, when Betty, covered in dust and cobwebs, was giving orders to James, and he was in some kind of apron in front of stacks of flour trying to do them, someone came through the open door. Hello, can you please tell me how I can find Betty? Betty the woman, or rather the young girl who came in, was standing against the sun and could not be seen. James came out of the kitchen. And me, Betty. I don't recognize you. She stepped closer and was stunned. The girl was looking at her with tear-filled eyes. Hi, Molly. It can't be Molly. The girls hugged each other and burst into tears. Of course, and James knew about Molly. Knew that Betty had looked for her, but hadn't found her. Knew she was worried sick. He waited for about 15 minutes, then walked determinedly over to them. Okay, you lovely ladies will have plenty of time to cry. Right now, we have work to do. The guests will be here soon. And this place is a mess. Molly gave him a startled look and Betty laughed. You're always right. Molly, I'd like you to meet Molly. This is my husband, James. We just got married 2 days ago. We just got here today, and the table's all set. You're just in time. Come on, help, and then we'll talk about it tonight. The three of us had more fun. Molly seemed to shake off the numbness she'd been feeling for the last couple months. She'd come here as her last hope. All she needed to do was talk to Betty, the one who always turned her in the right direction with her conversations. It was Betty who once made her change her desire to get rid of her parents into a desire to just live. Molly got caught up in a not-so-beautiful story, falling in love, believing. They had so much planned, so many plans. They decided to start their own business. Molly, who had been working at the factory for almost a year, took out a loan, and her fiancé was blown away. Had a fiancé and no fiancé. But Molly is not one to give up. So she went out on a limb and found him. He was just getting ready for the wedding, smirking directly into her eyes, said, well, and why did you come? Business didn't go well. I was upset. I didn't want to tell you. And then I met someone who helped me forget all about it. Molly crying asked, so you're not giving me the money back? Molly, what money? I'm telling you, it's gone. You should get out of here, or my fiancé will be here. She's very jealous and very angry. Her daddy's such a big man. They'll trample you down and leave you with nothing. Molly knew perfectly well that he was lying to her, only that she could. That's what the investigators told her. You gave him everything. That makes it voluntary. Molly sobbed at home for 2 days, and then took 2 weeks of vacation and went to the village to the address she had once been given by Betty. She hoped for nothing. No, she hoped one of her neighbors would give her coordinates. She didn't need anything from Betty, just to talk. And when she sees her with a young man, she's confused. Sorry, I guess she's not up to it. But Betty took her in like family. Within an hour, the building had forgotten everything that had happened to her, albeit temporarily. She was happy to help tidy up, then to cook for James, who turned out to be a very cheerful and good man. Somewhere in the back of her mind, there was a pang of envy. That's how easy things are, and she doesn't have it all together. There were a lot of people in Betty's backyard that evening. James, I was worried there wouldn't be enough treats. You shouldn't have. Everyone had brought something, some salad, some sausage, some pot of hot potatoes, and of course, almost every house brought its own beer. And something stronger. The next day at the family council, after hearing Molly's story, it was decided that she needed help. James immediately suggested that we talk at work about getting Molly there too. We make twice as much as you do in your factory. It was what it was. You're still gonna be charged for the loan. You've got to get out of it. Molly cried, thanked them, said she'd pay them back someday. And Betty was very proud of James, and a little bit proud of herself. If she hadn't been, she'd never remembered it in a single word. back in town, she decided she'd stay home for a while. Well, while she settled into this family nest, James had a small apartment, but still she went shopping, chose wallpaper, paint. Then they decided they needed to replace the sofa with a more modern one. So they did. But when Betty saw the price, she said, "No, we're not going to take it." James laughed. "Yes, we are. I'll make more money." Betty liked the role of homemaker so much that she put off the question of getting a job for a while longer. About a year later, James thought about starting his own firm. Betty could see that he couldn't make up his mind, but she wanted him to succeed. "James, are you worried about something?" "I can tell." He looked at her with a smile. "I keep forgetting that you can see right through people." "Yes, Betty. I think I've done the math a few times, but who knows which employees will get in, which suppliers. There's no way I can think of everything." "It's good that you're thinking things through. You know what? Let me sit in on the interview with you. I can see what kind of person you are." "Betty, right, that would be great. Of course, we're family." After the firm was open, Molly came to see her. "Molly, why don't you come by so often?" "Well, you've got your own thing going on." "There's a firm opening." "Oh, come on. She's just starting out. Who knows what she's gonna do?" "No, you and James are definitely gonna make it. It's not even close." Molly got up, walked around the kitchen. "I wish I could meet a James like that." I'd turn around too. "I'm sorry. I didn't like what she said." But she said with a smile, "So you can take anyone and mold them into your James." Molly looked at her like she was crazy. "Who am I?" "Well, you know I want it all." "And Betty?" Molly laughed. "Well, you're an adult. You know perfectly well that it doesn't work like that." "Why not?" "Why not?" Molly pouted her lips and sat back down, poured herself a full glass of wine and swigged it. "What kind of life is this? You want one thing and you get something else all the time." "Well, it's not just you." "Betty, how did you and James meet?" And Betty shrugged. "We didn't. Just on the street. Nothing romantic." "Well, I thought it was a romantic story." "No, it's just like everyone else." Betty would never tell anyone the story of how they met. The only thing everyone knew was that both James and Betty were from the orphanage. "Betty, talk to your husband." "About what?" "Well, that when a place opens up, he'll take me in. I feel better with one of you around." Betty smiled. "Well, sure, I'll talk to Molly." They stayed up late and didn't even hear James come in. He turned on the kitchen light. "So we're the ones having a night out." Betty laughed as she watched Molly flap her eyes at the bright light. She kissed her husband, and Molly jumped up. "Man, that's quite an arrangement. I have to go to work." In the morning, Molly smiled at Betty. She looked at James. Their eyes met, and they looked away from each other. And Betty fell asleep quickly. I guess it was the booze. And James stared into the darkness and thought. It was a month ago. He was sitting in his new office. It was still empty. Outside the window, it's deep evening. James is trying to arrange the furniture so he doesn't have to make the employees do it. Suddenly, the door opened, and he was surprised to see Molly. "Oh, Molly, are you doing something?" She didn't say anything. She walked around the office and pulled down the blinds. She was holding a bottle of wine. In fact, Molly didn't seem like herself today. Her hair was loose. "James, I've never seen her hair loose. And it appeared to be in a wave, clean, soft." Well, purely visually, Molly was wearing a long cape with an Italia belt. "And I came to congratulate you." Here she held out a bottle of wine, and I brought her a corkscrew. Molly was taking the corkscrew out of her pocket, and only now James noticed that the girl had already drunk. He opened the bottle, took out 2 tea mugs. "Yeah, I was drinking alone at home. You see, James, I don't even have anyone to drink with." She looked at him with sad eyes. He was kind of embarrassed. "Well, let me have a drink with you." They had a drink, and Molly burst into tears. She started to tell him how she wanted to live her life, started to tell him she was failing. Eventually, Molly started crying. Well, could James? He hugged her, wanted to calm her down, and the girl suddenly tore at the waist, and the cloak fell at their feet. You forgot your dress." Molly stood silent. James still didn't understand how it all happened. The wine drinking, or the setting, or Molly, who was so close. Then he apologized to her. She waved it away. "Oh, come on. That's why I came here." "Molly, we're not gonna say anything." Well, of course not. Molly decided to herself that she wasn't, because the time hadn't come yet. James glanced at his wife. He didn't want to do this, but it had happened. It wasn't his fault at all. It was her friend's fault. So it was Betty's fault. Why have friends worse than the enemy? But today, when he saw Molly, he had a fever. He remembered, almost felt, what she was like. She was different, like a tigress. Like a lioness. Betty would never in his life, under any circumstances, come to him like this, and certainly wouldn't have behaved the way Molly had. After Molly, he felt like a squeezed lemon. After Betty, after Winter, he didn't feel like anything. Yeah, he was his wife's first. That made him feel insanely good about himself. But that was the end of it. And Betty was gentle, obedient, but completely lacking in initiative. Not at all. James didn't realize he was missing the flame until he was alone with Molly. Molly had a way with everything. And now James was at a loss. He loved Betty, but he needed Molly too. Before he fell asleep, he had time to think. He was a businessman now. And all businessmen, however small, should have a wife and a mistress. In the morning, when Betty put breakfast in front of him, James asked Betty if you were mysterious. "What's the matter?" "No, James, I've got something to talk to you about. Actually, I have a favor to ask. You see, Molly says she's more comfortable when we're around, but she can't stay at home with me. So she asked me to take care of it for her for you. Maybe someday you'll have a place for her." "Great. Let her come over. I just need someone to do the paperwork." Betty thought for a moment. "James, is there anything else?" "I'd love to do the paperwork. I'm bored sitting at home." James tensed up. "I'm sorry, but you what?" "What paperwork?" "First of all, you don't know anything about this field. And secondly, husband and wife, they should work together." But James rushed over to hug her. "What about you? Why are you doing all this? Your vocation, your family, your husband and children. We're probably going to have kids soon, aren't we?" Betty smiled. James's words about children overrode all doubts. "Okay, James, you're right as always." 6 months later, they bought a nice 2-bedroom apartment, and Betty walked through the rooms and imagined what it would be like. Molly came to the housewarming party. "Well, Betty, now you're a real businessman's wife with no job. The apartment is gorgeous. Go to the salons. Make yourself beautiful. And that's it." Betty smiled. "I don't need a salon. I like everything so much." Molly threw her friend a glance and thought to herself, "Don't go." Of course, manicures interfere with housekeeping and moving furniture. Betty healed people's souls and buried her own. But on the other hand, it was so out of hand. James couldn't do without her anymore. And Molly did everything she could to keep him thinking about her. About a week after the move, Betty noticed something wrong. Her husband was irritable. He wouldn't answer in the right way all the time. So Betty sat him down in front of her. She was the only one who could help her husband find his mental balance. "James, what's the matter with you? You haven't been yourself these days." He shuddered, looked at Betty. "No, she definitely doesn't know anything. Betty, I've been offered a deal. You see, if I take it and do it right, it'll move my firm up a few notches. But if I can't do it, I can close the firm." And Betty smiled. Now her husband could use her. As always, though, when he hit a dead end. "James, let's start over. You've done something like this before." They talked for hours. James would doodle, calculate. And Betty was his brain trust. She gave him confidence. James made the deal. 2 months of tense waiting. And Betty supported her husband as best she could. He clung to her like a child, and said he was literally absorbing energy from her. And then he called and shouted into the receiver to Betty. They were all pleased. They transferred the money, and Betty almost cried. Well, you see, you all can skip the holiday dinner. Betty, I'll call you back. I can't talk right now. James has disconnected. What is that? He's never done this before. It's nothing. He's just really excited. Betty went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. So, what should I surprise James with tonight? I think I'll make fish. James loves fish. Meanwhile, in James' office, Molly was sitting in his office. James, you promised me earrings. Remember those? If the deal went through, James approached Molly. No problem. We'll go and buy them right now. And then we'll go to the restaurant. And then we'll go to your place. Molly looked at him with surprised eyes. So, maybe you'll stay the night too. Maybe I will. Are you serious? Then I don't need any earrings tonight. We'll get some later. Let's stop by the store and go to my place. Molly really wanted earrings, but she understood. Now the bigger game began. James alone wasn't enough for her. She wanted to take all of James. In a couple years, he'd gotten the firm so big. Looks like it's only gonna get better from here. So if she doesn't get any James, she's got the whole bag. You're willing to trade your earrings for my company? Molly snuggled up to him gently. Well, of course. How could anything compare to you? Molly's voice became low. James couldn't bear to listen to such a voice. He mentally berated himself on the way. But how could he have thought Molly was mercenary? Yes, she's the best. She's perfect. And that's the kind of thing you can only dream of. Now they're going to celebrate his deal. Celebrate it the way it deserves to be celebrated. Betty took the fish out, unwrapped the bag, started washing it. And then she felt so nauseous, she even dropped it on the floor. She rushed into the bathroom. Half an hour later, Pale sat on the couch and with trembling hands tried to pull out of her purse her woman's calendar. She looked at it and couldn't believe it. With all the turmoil of the deal, she had missed everything. She was 2 weeks late. It was a relief. She grabbed for the phone, but then put it away. No, James wouldn't say anything now. He'd tell her tonight at the holiday dinner. She imagined how happy he'd be. And Betty sat alone in the large apartment and smiled, breathing a little. She covered her nose with a towel, gathered up all the fish, stuck it in the freezer. It looked like she wouldn't be able to cook it for a long time now. But that was okay. She'd cook something else. A couple hours later, the table was set, and Betty looked at the clock at almost 9. Her James was running late. Another hour passed. She finally decided to call him to see what time he would arrive. James didn't pick up for a long time. When Betty did, she realized he'd been drinking, and he'd had a good one. Okay, James, where are you, Betty? Do I have to account for every move I make? She was confused, and then she heard a woman laughing. James, I'm actually waiting for you. He didn't let her finish. Don't wait up. Go to bed. My partners, and I will see you tomorrow. And he passed out. The woman looked at the phone in bewilderment. How do you even understand what it means not to wait? She sat for a long time. On the street already began to matchmake, when Betty all the same lay down. She now cannot worry. She needs a lot of sleep. When James hung up the phone, Molly immediately said how sick of twitching at every call. James, what is Betty to you? She's just a housewife. She sits around like a chicken on eggs and never goes anywhere. Aren't you bored with her? James leaned back on the pillow. Bored? You know, she's more like a mom than a wife. You know, get her cooking and all that. Molly snuggled up to him. You're cool. You have a business. Soon you'll be invited to parties where people from a different background vacation. How are you gonna go with her? What are you suggesting? You need a different kind of wife. A beautiful, fashionable one that you won't be ashamed to show off in any society. James didn't get angry like Molly had feared he would. He just smiled. I take it you're offering yourself. Molly decided to let it be. Now would be a good time. Why wouldn't it be? We look good together. We understand each other. We work together. I mean, I know your business. And more importantly, we're really good together. James couldn't help but recognize Molly's point. Sure, Molly's not Betty's brains, but he's a man, and he doesn't need brains around. He needs a real woman. You know, Molly, your offer is very interesting, and I'll think about it tomorrow. That night, Molly outdid herself. Everything must be done to make James understand the difference between Betty. When James fell asleep, Molly took a shower, threw on a robe, grabbed a glass, and went out on the balcony. The lights of the big city painted in front of her. Soon, everyone would know me here. She thought about how things could have turned out very differently. But it had turned out this way, so it was meant to be. James came home, only at lunchtime a little crumpled. And Betty couldn't be wrong. He smelled of women's perfume. It smelled familiar. Well, she's not going to guess. James, what's this all about? He left the table set from yesterday, which Betty had purposely left undone. You came over, poured yourself some wine, had a drink, that you didn't spend the night at home. Yeah, so, and Betty was confused. She didn't expect him to talk to her like that. At least she expected him to apologize and go to bed. You know, I wanted to tell you that I'm going to have a lot of work to do right now. You'll be outside alone all the time. It's such beautiful weather. Maybe you should go to the country. Betty didn't have time to answer. He closed the bedroom door behind him. She immediately packed up and went outside. She wandered around for a long time, just not knowing what to do. By late afternoon, she dialed her friend. Molly, hi. You busy? No. What's wrong with your voice? Molly, let's meet up. I need to talk to you, and I don't know what I'm gonna do. Sure, where are you? Half an hour later, the friends were sitting in the cafe, and Betty was telling Molly what had happened. You know, it's like he's distanced himself from me, like he's a stranger to me. And today he said he was going to be busy and that I should go to the country for a vacation. You see, I didn't even have time to tell him the most important thing. Molly looked up at her. The most important thing is this, Betty smiled. I'm pregnant. Molly froze at the sight of Betty. Really? That's as serious as it gets. Congratulations. That's great. Thank you, Molly. It's so good to have you. Molly smiled. That's right, girlfriend. Don't let me wipe my feet on you. You used to be my therapist. Now, I'm gonna be yours. If he's acting like this, he's sure you're not going anywhere. We have to talk him out of it. Do you know why he told you about the village? Because he's sure you're not going anywhere, and you're just going to wait for him day and night. That's no good. What am I going to do? You have to go away for a couple of weeks at least. You must never tell him you're pregnant. But have you lost all your skills? Will they be happy? Of course, they'll apologize to you. You stay, and you stay. And he'll make sure you're definitely not going anywhere now. You realize if you go away for a couple of weeks, James will sense your absence. And when he finds out you weren't afraid to go away, even when you're pregnant, he'll finally remember that you're human, and he'll come to his senses. You just spoiled him once. Molly was silent. Betty's pregnancy was clearly unnecessary to her plan, but she could use it to put the squeeze on her friend. Betty thought for a long time how Molly wanted to crack her and tell her to go back to her village so she wouldn't interfere with normal people's lives. But she remained patiently silent, and Betty looked up. Thank you, Molly. I'll do exactly as you advised. I'll go tomorrow morning. As soon as he goes to work. That's a good girl. You can't help all the time. Somebody's got to help themselves. James didn't come out of his room last night until Betty was in the other room. It's okay. She's going to get some air. He'll just let him do his own thing. In the morning, as soon as James slammed the door, Betty started packing, not taking much. What's 2 weeks? Yeah, James might come for her sooner. Left her husband a note. You're right, aren't you? I need a vacation. I thought my husband was coming early. He came 3 days later. He didn't come for her, though. She jumped out into the street to meet him, but immediately stopped. James was unloading suitcases and her books from the car. Turned around, saw her. "Meason, you're a smart broad. That, of course, is your only virtue. But it's enough to understand me, in general. Right now, you're not right for me. You're different. You can't shine. You can't be at receptions the way you should be." Betty suddenly calmed down, even grinned. "Are you already invited to the receptions?" James was a little embarrassed, but then he answered, "You know it's just a matter of time. The firm is growing, and very soon I will overtake many in the market. What about us?" "Betty, don't start, please. We don't exist anymore. There's you and there's me. I'm good. How am I gonna live? I don't have a place in the city. I don't have a job. How are we going to solve this problem? You didn't let me out to work. We're not going to solve anything. Everyone knows that I'm the only one who worked in our family, so Betty's not gonna give you anything. And don't you dare fight to live. You're from here, so live here. You got a house." James quickly got in his car and drove away, and Betty slid down the gate to the ground. What was she going to do? How would she live? The baby. And Betty sobbed and howled, and she didn't remember how Clara saw her, how she almost carried her to her house. Then she ran for the paramedic. The next day, Betty called Tatiana. "Molly, Betty, let's just get this straight. You're going to find out someday anyway. You're no good for Serioza. He'll be much better off with me. So it's you, Molly. How could you? You were a sister to me. I've always shared the last of my life with you. Oh, don't get your pink slips. Everybody lives the best life they can. You're mumbling, dude. Anyway, don't call me again. I have a month to redecorate your rustic apartment." And Molly disconnected. Out of guilt, she felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. Leaning against the wall, she walked outside just to get to Aunt Clara before she fell. She almost made it. Fell by the neighbor's gate. Betty. Betty opened her eyes abruptly. A young man was leaning over her, judging by the white doctor's coat. "Oh, how I got here. You too. Hello. Don't worry. An ambulance brought you in." And Betty tried to be a doctor. Wouldn't let her. "No, no. You can't get up. Absolutely not. Another day." "Why?" "Something tells me you want to keep the baby." And Betty, who was sure the baby was gone, went straight to bed. "Doctor, I'm begging you." And then he smiled a kind, human smile. "And I promise you everything that I can do, I will do, and even a little bit more." The doctor's name was Greg. He was the head of the ward and where Betty lay. He told her that her neighbor's grandmothers had called her an ambulance. It was only the fact that the ambulance was near the village that helped keep the baby alive. He often sat by her bedside. They talked a lot about the neighbor in the ward, moved Betty and herself embarrassed when the doctor came. But she realized she was waiting for him to come. One day he asked Betty, "I saw in your papers that you were married. Why doesn't your husband come to see you?" "Well, you could say I'm not married anymore. My husband chose someone else over me. But the child doesn't know anything and he won't find out." Yes, that's the situation. At that moment there was screaming in the corridor, a woman sobbing. "Excuse me, I'll go." Greg quickly left the room. But do women sit around when there's something going on? In the corridor, and really was beating hysterically, some woman from the wine realized that she had some problems with pregnancy, and the baby was long overdue. No husband, no nurses, no Greg to calm her down. Suddenly, Betty remembered everything she'd been taught. She stepped forward with determination. 15 minutes later, they were sitting with this pregnant lady and talking peacefully, as her husband, almost kissing her hands, Deni led his wife away from the hospital. Greg approached her. "Betty, you, however, have surprised everyone." She smiled. "It's nothing. You see, the mood swings of pregnant women, their tantrums. I had that in my exam." "What are you, a psychologist?" "I am." "No, I'm not. I studied to be a psychologist, but I haven't practiced a single day." "That's great. You have no idea how great it is." Greg headed for the chamber door, but then stopped abruptly. "And Betty, I'd forgotten why I'd even come. Could you come with me, please? Our chief wants to see you." The doctor rolled her eyes picturesquely and held a finger up. Betty laughed. "What does he want from me?" "Don't worry. I suspect he wants to thank you." And Betty shrugged. But if it was a thank you, they went up a floor higher as they walked. Betty learned that this hospital has a paid ward, and that's where the wives of the powerful have their babies. This woman is the wife of someone in the administration. She's having a difficult pregnancy, and she categorically does not want to go to the hospital. She's brought in by ambulance twice a week, and each time could be her last. Good thing her husband understands that. She's screaming that she's going to wipe this clinic off the face of the earth. Greg knocked on the office door. He opened it. "May I?" "Oh, yeah. Come in." A man came up to meet them. He was handsome. Looked about 50, 55 years old. Black hair cut short, black suit. "Very nice to see you." He took a step towards her and suddenly froze. Betty stopped too. She didn't understand why he was looking at her like that. Finally, as if he remembered something, he thanked her for a long time. And when Greg said she was a trained psychologist, she even stood up. "Listen, I have a proposition for you. You're a long way from a maternity leave. Why don't you come and work for us? Believe me, the pay is very good." And Betty was confused. "What's a decent salary?" "No, with experience. There are, but no one can stand it. Ladies, you know." She looked at the head doctor and realized that now she had a chance. A chance to make it. "Can I sit down?" Sure. I'm sorry, I got excited." And Betty sat down for a while and didn't say anything. Then she told her story very briefly. "As you understand, I don't have a place in the city. If it's possible to get a room here, of course I'll take it. It's a chance for me to survive." Anthony, that was the name of the head doctor of the hospital, smiled. "We've been working on a commercial basis for a while. The hospital can rent you an apartment. That's the least of your worries." A week later, Betty was moving into her new apartment. Greg took her to the village to get her things. While she was packing, he kept marveling at the beauty. "I haven't seen such beautiful nature anywhere, and here it's like everything is perfect and harmonious. You are very lucky to have a house in such a place." And Betty smiled, "That's for sure. You know, sometimes you go outside after a bapakwi and sit on a bench, and it's so beautiful and you don't want to go home." She suddenly caught Greg's attentive gaze and was embarrassed. But what was she thinking? She is pregnant by another man, or rather, by her husband. By the way, we need to file the divorce papers and turn this page. 5 years had passed. James sat at the desk across from him, Molly. He was staring at one point at the tablecloth and listening to what his wife was telling him. "And I can't live like this when I married you. You were so different. You were running a business. You had money. What now? You've managed to blow it all. Are you really that stupid? Then I don't see how you were capable of anything before." James clenched his fists. How he'd had Betty, who believed in him, supported him, and not Molly, who only knew how to say the word. James distinctly remembered failing the first one. The endless succession of failures in the caregiver. He had come home as usual as before and called out to Molly. How did he do it when Betty lived? Molly came out of the room and asked in a disgruntled voice, "Well, was I going to take a bath?" "Molly, sit down. I want to tell you what kind of deal I've been offered. We have to think about it, whether we take it or not." "You're crazy. I'm not interested in your deals and stuff. I'm not interested in bullshit." Molly went out the door. And James thought, well, maybe she's right. He wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. When the deal went sour and the firm took a big loss, he remembered Betty. Yes, if he'd consulted her as usual, everything would have been all right. "What do you want? Times are tough at the firm. We blew a few deals, and now no one wants to work with us with you because you're a completely worthless person, where you say you've been kicked into the bushes." That's where you belong. I don't get it. What's to understand? I want you to leave, but this is my apartment. I mean, you gave it to me as a wedding present. But Molly, James knew his wife had a lover, knew they'd have to break up anyway. But he hadn't been feeling confident lately, so he just kept quiet. Where am I going? That's your problem. You can go to your daughters. By the way, she was pregnant when you left her, so I think she'd be happy to see you. James looked at Molly and wanted to hit her more than anything. Only now did he realize what a mistake he'd made. James stood up. I guess I'll do that. He walked outside and got into the car. This was the way to think things through. Of course, Betty loved him very much, and there was no question that she would forgive him sooner or later, but he needed her to forgive him right away because he had no place to sleep. He never wanted to see his Molly again. Where could Betty be? In her village, obviously. If she was pregnant, she'd have no business being in town. Who'd want her with a potbelly and then a little baby? There's a risk that when the baby grew up, she rented something in town and got a job. But it's still unlikely. There's no job where you only have to work while the kid's in daycare. I had enough to live on and rent an apartment. So it's definitely in the country. James took out his wallet. That's enough for presents. We should buy a ring and get down on one knee. You know, like we're married. Betty's a romantic. She's gonna melt. But something for the kid, too. Damn, it's too bad he doesn't know who's in there. But you can get something that's good for both boys and girls. For example, an art kit would be such a lifesaver. And repentant. And it's a hat. James smiled. Betty needed him like air. Only now he realized that without her support, he really was nothing. The important thing was not to show it either. To make her grateful to him for coming back. James drove out of the yard and headed toward the mall. He'd have to splurge a little. The money was the last and only money, because the firm had gone under the hammer this morning. But it couldn't be helped. If he wanted a normal life, he had to pay for it. Betty Igorevna brought a present. Very good. Svetachka, ask the guard to put it in the car. Thank you. Betty looked out the window. She watched as the guard opened her car and carefully slid the box with the fancy slim TV into the back seat. It only just fit in there. Well, Aunt Clara would be pleasantly surprised. She said she'd love to have one of those, but it cost a fortune and she couldn't afford it. And Betty remembered. And that's when the opportunity came up. A week ago, a neighbor called and invited the family to an anniversary party. Landlady, I realize you're a busy woman right now, but I'd really like you to come. Greg and Arthur and Anthony, of course, will come. Aunt Clara, how old will you be? 18. Clara laughed. I wish I was 18, but unfortunately, 75. And Betty hung up the phone and smiled. Yeah, now she's a very busy, in-demand psychologist with her own office. Of course, if it wasn't for Dad. Anthony came to her new apartment 2 days after she had moved in. Betty was very surprised to see the head doctor on her doorstep, and even more surprised when she saw his eyes. Red, haggard. It's okay. Of course, Anthony, come in. He came through. He sat down on the couch. Betty, I've come to tell you a story. To be honest, I don't know how you take it, but I have to tell you right off the bat that I didn't know anything myself. Until I saw you many years ago, I am young and beautiful, and fell in love with an equally young and beautiful girl. I was young, hot. I was also very unattractive. We started dating, and I realized I wanted to marry her. We applied at the registry office. She was an orphan. So we decided to get married. We'd have a very small celebration, and for the bachelor party, I got drunk. I don't know how it happened, but that's no excuse. But I spent the night with someone else. Somebody told me everything. We had a terrible row, and she left. And I didn't try to make up. No way. I was a proud man. Then, of course, I came to my senses. But I couldn't find her. She just disappeared. No one saw her at work. They said she quit her job and was leaving. 10 years later, I met an old friend of hers. She's the one who said she didn't survive the birth, so she left me pregnant. Neither she nor the baby survived. When I saw you, I almost fainted. You and your mom, they're like two peas in a pod. So I took a test, sorry I didn't tell you. And when it confirmed you were my daughter, I started digging. She did give birth, but she didn't survive. And they took the baby out of you right away. It turns out she had a cousin. For some reason, they weren't in touch, and her parents didn't want to take her out of the orphanage. And somehow they found them just as your mom was about to go into labor. That's the story, Betty. I have no idea what's going to happen now, but I'm really asking you not to send me away. I never got married because, as it turned out, I loved Nellie more than I realized. I spent my whole life blaming myself. And then I find out I have a daughter. I'd really like to help you try to make things right, but I'm just so afraid you're going to drive me away. And Betty listened and couldn't believe her ears. Now it all fell into place. The talk of the village women and the words of her grandmother. I'd suspected it all my life, but I kept chasing it away. Turns out she looked at Anthony for nothing. Tears came out of her eyes. Of course I didn't. It's a very scary life when you don't have anyone close to you. Greg arrived in the evening, caught Betty's boss, and was very surprised. And there was a lot to be surprised about. Anthony rolled up his sleeves trying to hang a curtain rod. Hello, Anthony. Hi. Perfect timing. Come on in. You can help. Betty looked at Greg with confusion. She knew something was brewing between them, but she also knew it shouldn't be. And then it started to happen. It started to happen. Before her maternity leave, Betty worked in a hospital. Soon enough, her patients' acquaintances began to contact her. And just before she gave birth, Greg proposed. She tried to talk him out of it for a long time, explaining that she had a baby on the way and that he didn't need such a wife. But Greg was adamant. He simply asked, "Honestly, do you love me?" Betty was confused at the time. "I do, but that doesn't mean everything." Not another word. "I love you, you love me, and the two of us will love the baby." When Arthur was born, his grandfather offered Betty his office. She might not have taken the plunge, but she had such strong support from her dad and husband that there was no chance of failure. James pulled up in front of the house. All the way there he was making up speeches, and it wasn't working. He even had to stop to think it over again. He even wrote down what he needed to say on a piece of paper. But he wouldn't look at it, of course. But he would remember the house had changed a lot. He sat in the car and looked at the new windows and new gates with amazement. In general, from the old only a lilac bush in front of the entrance. Strange. Betty didn't seem to be poor at all. That made it difficult. Then it was love that had to be pressed. Not the kind of man to forget so quickly. He was sure his ex-wife still suffered and loved him. James approached the gate is closed, but there is a bell. He pressed the button for a long time, but nobody came out. So no one's home. Well, nothing he is not proud. He'll wait. James sat down on a bench. Everyone in the village had a bench like that by the gate. He'd sit and think about it. And he'd get lucky. A neighbor stood in front of him. Yes, the same Aunt Clara. James did. "Aunt Clara, hello, you don't recognize me." She squinted. "No way. James, are you?" "I'm a woman with tight lips." "Why did you come and talk to Betty?" "I don't think she'd be happy to see you." James was starting to get angry, so she'd made a monster out of him. "But that's for us to decide whether she's happy or not." "Where is she?" "She'll be here soon." "So Betty doesn't live here?" "She hasn't lived in town for a long time." James wondered what there was to do. "You don't know where she rents an apartment in town." "She doesn't. She lives in her own house." "I've been to her beautiful house. It's a big house." He almost laughed, but very much like Betty. But blowing dust in her eyes, only to have no one feel sorry for her, no one worry about her. "But clearly, I can give you the address of that house." "No, I won't. In case Betty doesn't want to see you." "What are you talking about?" "Betty won't want to see me." "Do you believe that?" "I do. I guess you don't. Aunt Clara, I really need to talk to you. James was tired of talking to this old woman who thought she knew everything. So talk. They should be here soon. At that moment, 2 cars appeared on the road. There they were. James even opened his mouth. The first car was a big black Jeep, and the second one was the same white one. Both cars stopped in front of the house. A little boy jumped out of the second one and rushed to Grandma Clara Granny. She picked him up in her arms. "You're my good boy." 2 men got out of the first car, one older and carrying a large bouquet of flowers. The other was about James's age. The older one went over to Aunt Clara, handed her the flowers. He said something. James made out that the gift was coming to a celebration. The younger man helped him out of the car. No way, it was Betty. James would never recognize her if he met her on the street. She didn't see him. She rushed over to hug Aunt Clara. "How did I miss you? I left all my Miranda business on vacation and decided to take a week off." Clara smiled. "That's good. Arthur, man needs fresh air. Not with the whole family, just with Dad, Greg and his laboring wife, and Betty. There's James, and who's waiting for you." And Betty turned, and the smile slipped right off her face. She took a step toward her ex-husband. "What do you want here?" He hadn't expected such a meeting. He was confused. "But I'm here to talk." "I don't have anything to talk to you about. You go talk to Molly." So she kicked me out. James almost bit her tongue off. But why? I should have said what I had to say. I left. I realized I made a mistake and I left. "A mistake? I'm sorry," she laughed. "So after Molly dumped you, you decided to make me happy?" "No, you've got it all wrong." James felt bad that Betty had figured him out right away. He could see that the men were approaching them too. And it wasn't a good look. "I just thought we were doing so well. We loved each other so much. Maybe we should try again." He realized he was talking nonsense. Betty had a wedding ring on his finger, and not just any ring, but a cool ring. The young man had the same ring on his finger. "James, I'm just amazed at you. You were driving down here. What were you thinking? That I'm sitting here like I was 5 years ago, sobbing and waiting for you. You left me penniless, homeless. You knew I didn't work, that I had nothing. And now you're claiming everything as if nothing had happened." "Excuse me, Arthur's here." "Mom, who's that uncle?" "Oh, son, that's a completely foreign uncle. He's just mixed up, and he's on his way out." And Betty took Arthur by the hand, and they disappeared behind the gate. Aunt Clara stayed behind to watch the men. James felt out of place, but something had to be done. He looked at the young man. "I understand you are the one who adopted my son. I'd like to negotiate terms where he won't find out. Maybe we can make some money." The school was immediately burned by the blow. James didn't realize he was on the ground. Betty's husband was leaning over him. "If you ever show your luck in the field again, I'll just bury you." Anthony grinned. "And I'll help." Clara smiled. "I'll give you a shovel. I've got a good one." James silently stood up, shook off his pants, and moved toward the car with a hum. It flared with a bright flame. So there would be a bruise. That's okay. He'd get the beating off now, and then this family would be in trouble. He took off, so that the dirt and roots, grass and earth flew. When he gets to town, he's gonna show them all. But he didn't get to the police until 2 days later. He'd been drinking and his friend had run out of money. He had to act. In 2 days, we learned a lot about Betty. There was enough money in that family, so it was a good option. He was escorted to the chief of police after they read his statement. He came into the office. "Have a seat. I see you want to punish Greg. Well, I already know you've been drinking for 2 days. It's a job description, you know. But the fact that you might have had a fight with your buddies, you know that, don't you? One last thing. You try to ruin the life of a doctor with a golden hand and a head. I'll ruin your life. You got it." The chief of police didn't bother to tell it to the man that if it hadn't been for Betty and Greg, he wouldn't have had a child, and maybe even a wife. James went outside. So now what? He had absolutely no idea what to do. No support, no advice. Look, man, throw some on. Throw some on. Then we can get a vial. He wasn't looking at a homeless man, but a man who was on his way. I live in the private sector with a garden. What from the bed? James poured him everything he had. The man was happy. It's enough for a couple of bubbles. I'll be right back. Like so much in our lives, it depends on the decisions we make. But James realized too late how wrong he'd been to betray Betty.